Welcome, nutritionradio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, a university nutrition professor of over 20 years and podcast host of long-running shows like Iron Radio. Come on in. Lecture time. Hey, everybody. Well, if you recall, last week we had a lecture. We went into the classroom. There was a lecture going on concerning digestion. Digestion and absorption, the two main features of your digestive tract, your GI tract, gastrointestinal tract. Today, we're going to follow up with that with a part 2, and next week we might even do a part 3. If you really don't care for a classroom where you don't have to study and memorize it for a grade, in fact, maybe that's attractive to you, but this is just classroom stuff. It's a little dry, but like we said last time, if you understand the body, you can ask the right questions and even manipulate the system. There's some examples in here about bitter foods and Guinness and all. I try to put in some different things, even when I'm in the classroom. This is literally me from university teaching in the past. So I hope this isn't too dry. Let's go on in and check out what's happening in this second part.
But let's get back to the digestive tract, the GI tract. As we mentioned, it's essentially a long tube from mouth to anus. It's open to the environment, but food certainly moves through this tube. So the second major bullet here, other than simply long tube, is peristalsis. Peristalsis is the action of muscle. It's muscular contractions. So our first little sub-bullet here under peristalsis is muscular contractions. Those move food along throughout your GI tract. So I'm usually telling students, for example, you could take a bite of food standing on your head. You could swallow it, and it's still going to go into your stomach. It's still going to move in the right direction. This usually happens, right? And again, it's because of these muscular contractions. So if you look at the diagram, it really gives you a good idea of how this might work. You chew up food into a little ball, a bolus, and you swallow it. And then you can see that the muscles contract behind the bolus, and that's going to force it forward a little bit, this food mass. Then behind it again, you'll see a little contraction of the muscles that line this tube, right, your GI tract, pushing that bolus further down, that food mass further down, and then it happens again and again. Almost think about a marble in a garden hose, right? If you grabbed behind the marble and squeezed and then hand over hand kept doing that, you would push the marble through the garden hose. That's peristalsis. Let's go to the next slide and we'll start the digestive tract here. It starts in the mouth, digestion does, with the act of chewing. So our first major bullet here is chewing. That's mechanical breakdown of food. The mechanical part of this is important, not just chemical, right, enzyme breakdown of food, because you need to sort of disperse and break up the larger chunks so the enzymes and the chemistry can get in and work on it. So chewing produces smaller particles of food. Saliva comes into play. Saliva is very important in your mouth. It's not just moisture and a lubricant so you can swallow foods and they're not too dry, but you have enzymes in your saliva. So it's both a lubricant and a medium where there's enzymes that start attacking things like carbohydrates and fats. Our second major bullet here, other than chewing, is taste buds. Taste buds are receptors in your mouth that you can sense, obviously, different aspects of food. Sweet, sour, salty, bitter, savory. Savory is called umami, U-M-A-M-I. Some people have more preference for sweets, and others have more preference for savory foods. In fact, I just read a research paper this past week suggesting that some of the reasons that people might like more bitter foods, like if you like, something like unsweetened black tea or Guinness beer or something like that, or dark chocolate that's not sweetened. People who like a little bit more bitter, it might be psychological. It's not all in the taste buds, but interesting stuff. The traditional map of the tongue, I think if you talk to people who are into sensory evaluation, and that's a big thing, and people have whole jobs in sensory eval. I've seen books 4 inches thick on calculations and they really go deep into sensory evaluation. The smell, the taste, how it's linked, the texture of the food, all these different things. But the point being is that the map of the tongue is a little bit oversimplified. It's not always sweet just at the tip and that sort of thing. You probably have taste buds throughout your oral cavity and that sort of thing. But I digress. The third bullet on this slide is bolus. I've already used that term. That's the amount of food swallowed at one time. That's that little marble-sized piece of food, that food mass that we talked about. That's a bolus. And then the last bullet on this slide is simply epiglottis. The epiglottis is a little structure at the back of your mouth, the back of your throat, that blocks the windpipe. We need the food that you swallow, that bolus, to go down the esophagus, right? Down the tube to the stomach. We don't want it going into your trachea, right? Obviously, you can breathe in through your mouth. We don't want that. That's called aspiration, and obviously people choke, or if they get just little tiny trickles of food down into their lungs, it can cause very serious problems when people are in the hospital. We don't want aspiration. Obviously. So the epiglottis is your friend, and it keeps things moving down the right tube. So let's talk about that tube. The esophagus, if we go to the next slide here, first bullet, is the tube from your mouth to your stomach. It's not very rigid with rings around it like your trachea. The trachea is a bit more like a vacuum cleaner in your house, the hoses that those use. The rings keep it from collapsing. Your esophagus isn't like that. It's a bit mushier, less rigid, but a tube from your mouth to your stomach that obviously carries food. And again, peristalsis takes place, moves food down toward your stomach. Our second major bullet here is, in fact, stomach. So your stomach has strong muscles that mix and churn the food. We're back to that mechanical aspect of digestion. And interestingly, it also adds fluid. About 2 liters a day worth of water goes into these stomach secretions. So 2 liters per day. Things like hydrochloric acid. Your stomach produces very strong acid. The pH is about 3 to 4. So if you remember from sort of high school biology, on a 14 scale, the lower, the more acidic. So 3 to 4, very acidic. I mean, this would eat a hole through the carpet if you left it long enough. But your stomach also secretes mucus along its walls, and that's what protects it. You're regularly secreting mucus. That's where some more of the fluid and secretions come from. So 2 liters a day going into your stomach. And then the last major bullet here is chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. That's what's left in your stomach after a lot of churning. I mean, your stomach is the most muscular digestive organ. You can see in the cross-section here in the picture, there's bands of muscle. They go transverse and longitudinal and diagonal. There's all these muscles churning the food. The acids break it apart, unravel proteins and things like that. So what's left is chyme. And that's an important thing to remember. If you go into a clinical field, or even if you don't, that by the time quote-unquote food leaves your stomach, it's liquid. It's liquid. So when we talk about small intestines and on to the large intestines and eventually out, it's liquid. So that's chyme. The chyme remains for 2 to 6 hours in your stomach. It depends on what you ate. Some foods are very fast and they move through quite quickly. Something like a sports drink, like a Gatorade or a Powerade, it's dilute. It's meant to be very easily digested and absorbed and very fast. That's because athletes need their blood sugar to stay up during exercise kind of thing. Another example might be proteins. There are fast and slow proteins. Fast proteins are things like whey protein, W-H-E-Y. A lot of you are familiar with whey. It's a very high-quality protein, and it's very fast. The gastric emptying, in other words, is low. The time it takes to leave your stomach is low. There are other proteins, like casein, the other major milk protein, and it is slow. It clots in the stomach and moves through much more slowly. So it's interesting for clinical patients, for athletes, we can manipulate fast and slow proteins. It's just one example of how long this chyme remains in your stomach. So 2 to 6 hours, 2 to 6. So quite a big range there. Also, did you ingest it as a solid or a liquid, things like that. Ultimately, though, what's very important is this chyme enters your small intestine. So that's the first stop after your stomach, is the first stage of your small intestine. It's called the duodenum or the duodenum. It's only about 10 inches long, but we'll get to that on the next slide. First, let's just dive into this picture just a little bit of the stomach. So at the top, it shows the esophagus coming down into your stomach. You can see the muscles around the stomach, the lining. And I put a star on it that I want you to really know, is that the little valve, the little circular muscle or sphincter at the bottom of the stomach is called the pyloric sphincter. That opens periodically to let the chyme, the juices, trickle into your duodenum without sort of overwhelming it, right? So if you eat a large meal, it's not all going to, your stomach is large, but the duodenum, the first stage of your small intestines, is not so large in its volume. So the pyloric sphincter is very important. It opens periodically and lets the chyme out. If you do have clinical interests, some people also have a problem with the sphincter on the top edge, the superior aspect of the stomach. That's the LES, the lower esophageal sphincter. So some people, that gets too tight and they can't swallow food well. Sometimes it's too loose or it's malfunctioning and the acids from the stomach come back up into the esophagus, things like that. So we've got a circular muscle or a sphincter on both the top and the bottom, if you will, of the stomach. And that pyloric sphincter is one that I often put on a test question. So that's where we are. It does show the small intestine, and you're starting to get a sneak peek on the slide of the villi, the carpet-like inner lining of the small intestine, and they even show you the large intestine on the very right side of this diagram. But we're focused mostly on the stomach right now. We'll get to those other parts.
Okay, so there you go, another section of the digestion lecture. I'm trying to use lots of examples when I teach. Again, talking about, Guinness or coffee or types of protein, like why. Now you know why whey is fast, why casein is slow. You may have known that already. But knowledge is power, applied knowledge is power, and that's why I offer these educational, these lecture tidbits as well. It lets us keep up with the schedule that we do now. Obviously, we're going to have larger single episodes coming down the pike, full-length episodes. I'll probably just call them bonus episodes. Think of some name. But for now, there's something for your commute to work, and we'll see you next time. The NutritionRadio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.